Um, so welcome to this, which is the first lecture of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society for 2023. My name's Sarah Pierce, and I'm the chair of the society. And today we're very privileged, very excited to welcome Professor Yonatan Adler, who's going to speak to us on the subject of the origins of Judaism. But before I give a brief introduction to Yonatan and we hear from him, I need to just go through a few technical points, although I'm sure that many, if not all of you, will be very familiar with how the technology works with these virtual lectures. So on entry into this virtual world, your video screen has been turned on, but if you'd like to switch it off, then you just need to click on the video tab to do so. We do encourage all our guests to let everyone have the benefit of seeing you, as it gives a much more personal and community atmosphere to our lectures. So please feel free to keep your camera on if you're able to. All microphones have been switched off to reduce the background noise, and please do keep your microphone off unless you're invited to turn it on to speak during the question and answer session at the end. We do allow plenty of time for questions after the lecture, and if in the course of the lecture you're inspired by a particular question, please feel free to put your question into the chat in the course of the lecture, or put your question into the chat when the lecture has finished. Either is absolutely fine. And I will either read out your question to our speaker, or I'll invite you as the person giving the question to deliver it yourself if it's a complicated one. If you don't know where the chat button is, it should be at the bottom of your screen. And I've got it open at the moment, inviting people to put their questions into the chat. Please note that this lecture is being recorded, and that is so as to make it available to the general public on our website. Initially, it's made available to our members and then to everybody else. So if you've missed any of our previous lectures that you'd like to watch and listen to, please check out our website where you'll find all our previous lectures. One final point, rattling the tin, so to speak. We are a charity, and we do rely on our membership fees and generous donations from our friends to continue our activities of lectures, and principally to continue our ability to support grants to students who we hope very much will be able to go on digs later this year in Israel and the surrounding region. And lastly, but by no means least, we use our funds to help to publish our peer-reviewed journal, Strata. If you become a member, not only do you help to fund these important activities, but you will also receive a copy of Strata. If you're here and you're not a member, no pressure, but I do urge you to join by getting in contact with Sheila Ford, our administrator, whose email you will already have. The cost is very reasonable, and the benefits, both to you and to the wider world, are substantial. So now, if I may, I want to introduce our speaker. I'm very, very excited to introduce Professor Yonatan Adler. You will no doubt have read about him already in the newspapers. It's not so often that we get someone who writes a book about ancient Judaism to get headline news within a month or so of the publication of their work. So we're very fortunate to have Yonatan with us so soon after the publication of that work and his growing fame. Yonatan is Associate Professor at the Department of Land of Israel Studies and Archaeology at Ariel University. He's also the head there of the Institute of Archaeology. And recent excavations in which he has led include the sites of Einot, Amitai and Rainar in the Galilee. In 2018, he was appointed by the Minister of Culture to the Israeli Council for Archaeology. Yonatan has written extensively on the subject of archaeology and material evidence relating in particular to the observance of Torah law, covering topics including ancient ritual immersion pools, dietary laws, ancient tefillin found in the Judean desert, and also chalk vessels. And his latest book, which I referred to just now, The Origins of Judaism, an archaeological historical reappraisal, was published by Yale University Press in November 2022, and it is, as I said, already making headlines. So please join me in welcoming Yonatan. Thank you.
Many thanks for that very kind introduction, Sarah. And let me put up my PowerPoint presentation. And let's find the PowerPoint presentation. All right. So I will be speaking about the book, The Origins of Judaism, and I'd like to begin with a few definitions. So first of all, what do I mean when I speak about Judaism? The Jewish way of life, as I'm sure everyone here knows and is quite familiar with, has been characterized for much of history by adherence to the laws of the Torah. And by that, I mean adherence to such rituals as the purity laws and Tefillin, Mezuzah, the various holidays that we're all familiar with, Sabbath prohibitions, a myriad of detailed laws which affect the lives of Jews from the morning they wake up until the minute they go to sleep, from cradle to grave. These are laws which affect every aspect of life, day-to-day life. And this already begins quite early. The question that I ask in this book is, when does this begin? So in terms of the definition of Judaism that I'm looking for the origins of this Judaism. I define it in the book as the Judean way of life governed by Torah law. My point isn't to give a definition of Judaism, but my point is to have a name that I can use to refer to when I'm speaking about this thing that interests me. The Judean way of life governed by Torah law. In simpler terms, from when do we have evidence that Judeans are observing the laws of the Torah? And the question is a question which is not per se a new question. Scholars have been looking at early Judaism and the origins of the Torah itself for quite some time. And already when we go back to the early 19th century and throughout the 19th century, scholars have noticed that when we look at the books of the Hebrew Bible, the figures that we find, the characters that we find in the Hebrew Bible don't appear to be practicing Judaism. They don't appear to be practicing this Torah law that I have just described. To the contrary, they seem to be doing things that are very different from Torah law. And in fact, we have several biblical passages which refer to the Judeans and Israelites not keeping the laws of the Torah. This scholarship in the 19th century has suggested that the Babylonian exile should serve as a watershed between an earlier ancient Israel and a post-Babylonian exile Judaism. This is something which was already suggested by De Wette and has been, I would say, a mainstay of biblical scholarship from the beginning of the 19th century, essentially until today. Julius Wellhausen, particularly, stressed the figure of Ezra as the beginning of Judaism. Ezra, as the figure which biblical story tells us, brought the Torah from Babylonia and stood up on a wooden platform according to the book of Nehemiah 8, stood up on a wooden platform in Jerusalem and read a scroll of the Mosaic Torah before the entire Judean assembled audience. And it was from this period in time that we can begin to speak of Judaism. From this period of time when the Judeans came to know of the Torah and to actually be putting it into practice. Now, the question is, how did Wellhausen know that this story actually took place, that this is not just a story, but that this is actually history. So Wellhausen explains this to us in a footnote um, in his famous book, The Prolegomena. He writes, "The credibility of the narrative appears on the face of it." Now, whenever I speak about this in public forums, when it's a scholarly forum, I usually hear snickers at this point, and rightly so. We don't do history in this way. We don't read any ancient narrative and assume that if the story sounds credible, that it must have happened. Right? We don't just assume that if there's no miracles in the story and it doesn't sound too incredible to believe, that we simply believe the story on the face of it. History doesn't work that way. And there's good reason to question whether there actually was Ezra figure at all, and certainly that this story took place as it was told. Even if we were to accept the story as told and naively assume that there was such an Ezra figure in the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era that stood up on a wooden platform in Jerusalem and read the Torah, the biblical story itself never makes the claim that this acceptance of the Torah in the middle of the 5th century with Ezra had any continuity, that it continued and endured any length of time beyond the story itself with Ezra in Jerusalem. And in fact, in Nehemiah 13, we find that when Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem, according to the standard understanding that this is going in chronological order, this story, Nehemiah comes after Ezra and discovers the people of Jerusalem sinning against the Torah, discovers the people of Jerusalem breaking the laws of the Sabbath and intermarrying with foreign women. And the story itself never makes the claim that there was any endurance to what happened with Ezra in Jerusalem in the middle of the 5th century. And so I think there is certainly room to question the long-standing assumption that Judaism emerged sometime after the Babylonian exile during the Persian period. I think we need to go about answering this question in a much different way. And so I'd like to begin by discussing the method that I use in pursuing this question. From when do we find evidence for the observance of the Torah? Now, before I get into the details of the method, I want to be very clear that what interests me here is widespread observance of the Torah amongst ordinary Judeans. I'm not interested in the question of when ideas that we find in the Torah first appear. In the book, I call this intellectual history, or the history of ideas, which is certainly very important, and that's what biblical scholars have been invested in for most of biblical scholarship. The question of when the various ideas that we find in the Torah first came about, the history of the text itself, how the various parts of the text came together, and when. None of this is of interest to me in this book, and I won't touch on these questions because I'm interested in a very different question. The question that interests me is not intellectual history, but rather social history. I'm interested in what the ordinary people, the farmers, the homemakers, the craftsmen, what the people that you would find on the street were actually doing. And so the question is a question of social history rather than intellectual history. The method that I go about in trying to answer this question, when do we first find evidence for the widespread observance of the Torah, is quite a simple one. I begin from a period in time when we have ample evidence that ordinary Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah. And what I show throughout the book, and what I'll show throughout this evening, is that the 1st century of the Common Era is precisely such a period of time. The 1st century of the Common Era is a time when we have ample evidence, both archaeological and textual, which indicate that ordinary Judeans were keeping the laws of the Torah on a widespread basis. The 1st century of the Common Era is that benchmark which we will use as our starting point, from which we will go backwards to look for evidence in earlier periods. So we'll look for evidence from the first century of the Common Era backwards to the first century before the Common Era. From there to the second century before the Common Era, from there to the third century before the Common Era, the fourth century, and so on and so forth. Going backwards in time, looking for evidence that ordinary Judeans are aware of the laws of the Torah and actually putting them into practice. Eventually, we'll reach the end of the trail. Eventually, the trail of evidence will go cold. And at that point, we can say we have a terminus ante quem, meaning that from that point on, Judaism must have appeared. Judaism must have appeared then or earlier. That's the meaning of the terminus ante quem in this context. And as such, we have a very clear dating for the emergence of Judaism. Now, when I say clear dating, that doesn't mean that it happens then, right? What we do, and we do this in archaeology, we do this in history, we look for what the evidence actually is. And what the evidence will be able to tell us is that the thing, when it first appears, the first earliest evidence appears, that tells us that the thing must have begun then or earlier. So it's very important to stress this. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What we will end up with is a terminus ante quem at the end of the trail. And to cut to the chase, I'll already, from the beginning, tell you what that end of the trail is, and then we'll look through the evidence and see how that plays out. But the end of the trail, when we look at practice after practice, is in the middle of the second century before the Common Era, so the Hasmonean period. When we look at practice after practice, the earliest evidence we have for widespread Torah observance is in the middle of the second century before the Common Era. When I speak of evidence, I mean both text and archaeological evidence. So I'm looking not only at texts, which is historians usually look at, and I'm not looking at only archaeology. Of course, archaeologists generally look at. I'm looking at any evidence we have for that Torah observance, and there are going to be practices which leave no archaeological remains. Right? I can think of, for example, circumcision or Sabbath prohibitions generally don't have any physical remains which might indicate the observance of these rules. And in this case, all we'll have is the textual evidence. But for our purposes, we are interested in any kind of evidence which indicate widespread observance of Torah laws. The book is arranged in the following manner. So the first 6 chapters look at individual practices and prohibitions. So we look at dietary laws, ritual purity, figural art, filin and mezuzot, miscellaneous practices, which include circumcision, Sabbath, Passover, Sukkot, Yom Kippur. I also look at the knowledge of a commandment to have a 7-branched menorah in the temple. These are most miscellaneous practices which have somewhat limited evidence, so I put them all into one chapter. But these are all practices and prohibitions which we have evidence for in antiquity, and I look to see when they'll begin. The synagogue is not practice or prohibition per se. We don't find the synagogue in the Torah itself, but as I'll explain later on, the synagogue was the preeminent, I would call it, educational institution of the Judeans in antiquity. This is where Judeans learned about the Torah, and it's, I would say, the driving force for the spread of the Torah amongst ordinary Judeans. What I do in the 7th chapter is look beyond the terminus ante quem that we've established in the first 6 chapters. So the first 6 chapters are data-driven. I'm looking for the earliest evidence we have for Torah observance for each of these individual sets of practices and prohibitions. And then I establish in each of those chapters terminus ante quem. As I already said, in each of those chapters, the terminus antiquem is the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. In the 7th chapter, I look beyond that terminus antiquem. So I look at that period of time, or those periods of time, which predate our terminus antiquem, to see, all right, what kind of evidence do we have, contextual evidence, surrounding evidence, do we have of Judean practices in this earlier period of time, which might indicate the emergence or not emergence of Judaism at this early date. So in the 7th chapter, I begin with the Persian period, and then look at the early Hellenistic period, and then the late Hellenistic period. What I'd like to do now is to go through each of these chapters very briefly, brief time that we have here, to look at some examples of various laws and the prohibitions and practices that are cited that we have here in these various chapters, to see what the evidence actually indicate. And there will be a little bit of time at the end to look at what I do in the 7th chapter and to see what kind of contextual evidence we do have from the Persian and Hellenistic periods. So let's begin with the dietary laws. The 1st century of the Common Era has provided us with numerous textual sources which indicate that Judeans were widely observing dietary laws based on the Torah. What comes up again and again, particularly amongst non-Judean writers, Greek and Latin authors on Jews and Judaism come to mind. Nachum Stern's book on non-Judean authors writing about Judaism. What comes up again and again is that Judeans abstained from pork. And we have, for example, a story about Augustus quipping that Herod, he would prefer it to be Herod's pig rather than his son, of course, because Herod's son he would have slaughtered, and this pig would have been granted clemency as a pig, because Judeans didn't eat pig. Now, the fact that Romans were telling jokes about Judeans not eating pigs, I think, is a clear indication that Judeans, in fact, refrained from eating pigs, because if they hadn't, the jokes simply wouldn't have been funny. So the fact that Romans are telling these jokes is a clear indication that people knew that Judeans largely abstained from eating pig. And when we look at the archaeological evidence, we actually find this to be the case. We find that Judeans were not eating pig. But here I want to point out a methodological mistake that I think scholars often make, especially when looking at earlier periods when we don't have such textual evidence. The fact that people aren't eating a certain food doesn't necessarily imply that a taboo is involved. It doesn't necessarily imply that people were abstaining from that food. So I'm drawing a distinction here between not eating a food and abstaining from a food. And just as an example, I know in Israel and in the United States as well, several countries in Europe, people generally don't eat goat meat. But goat meat is not taboo in these countries. People don't abstain from eating goat meat. It's simply something which, for one reason or another, farmers tend to not raise goats for their meat, and people tend to not buy goats, but it's not because they're abstaining. So when we find periods of time when we don't have pig consumption, it's not necessarily an indication that people are abstaining. So in fact, in the 1st century of the Common Era, we don't have pig at Judean sites in the Levant. We do have copious amounts of pig remains, pig bones, at non-Judean sites in the Levant, which fits in well with the textual sources that speak of Judeans abstaining from pork due to Torah law. So this fits in very well, and it's the most likely explanation for why Judeans weren't eating pig at this time. We find in earlier periods this abstention, this Judean abstention from eating pork, we continue to find in texts dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, even the 2nd century before the Common Era. Prior to this time, we find no texts, and the texts that we have prior to the 2nd century BCE tend to be a biblical text. None of these texts suggest that ordinary Judeans were abstaining from pig or any other kind of food due to any kind of Torah law. We simply don't have any textual evidence. The archaeological evidence, which is often spoken about, is lack of pig bones at Judean sites in the Iron Age. And this is true. Recent studies by Lidar Sapir-Hain and her colleagues from 2013 and onward have shown that, in fact, Judean sites from the Iron Age 1 through the later Iron Age, tend to lack pig bones. But this isn't, as I said, this isn't necessarily a matter of taboo. And so we do find, for example, that Canaanite sites in the Bronze Age also lack pig bones, and Philistine sites, which are rural, also lack pig bones. So we can't necessarily associate lack of pig bones or presence of pig bones with a particular ethnic group, or necessarily explain why we have this lack of pig bones. And there could very well be economic or ecological reasons for this. Fish remains are another interesting archaeological phenomenon, which we find, to the contrary, Judeans and Israelites are eating for what came to be prohibited fish. Both Leviticus and Deuteronomy speak of rules about what kinds of fish are prohibited. Those which lack fins and scales are prohibited from eating. And when we look at the archaeological evidence, we find that Judeans and Israelites were eating scaleless fish, such as catfish, sharks, and rays, throughout the Iron Age, and in fact into the Persian period. We have a number of archaeological contexts from Persian period Jerusalem with catfish bones, shark cartilage as well. So the earliest archaeological contexts which essentially lack such prohibited bones date to the Roman period. This is a study which I published with Professor Omri Lernow back in 2021. So again, to sum up, looking at the dietary laws, the earliest evidence we have for adherence to the dietary laws comes from textual sources from the Hasmonean period. Purity is another phenomenon we find ample evidence for in the 1st century of the era. So we have both textual sources, gospel texts which speak about Judean observance of purity laws, Josephus as well. And this seems to have been something which was quite common, widespread, not connected to the temple or the priesthood per se. This is something which it seems that everyone was doing on a daily basis. We find, for example, immersion pools throughout the country, both in domestic contexts, in private homes and courtyards, but also in various contexts related to production of agricultural products, wine presses, olive presses. We find it in bathhouses, we find it in pottery production sites. We find these immersion pools everywhere that there were Judeans. When we plot the sites where we find these immersion pools on a distribution map, we find that essentially anywhere where there were Judeans, all throughout the Judean areas of settlement, we find these immersion pools. So this is something which it seems that just about everyone was doing within Judean society for a century. And when we look backwards in time, the earliest evidence we have for these immersion pools appears around the year 100 BC. So possibly a little bit earlier, possibly the late 2nd century BCE, but certainly no earlier than that. This is a Hasmonean phenomenon, the emergence of these immersion pools. Another phenomenon which appears around the same time is chalk vessels. This is a unique family of tableware and storage vessels, which first appear, again, around the year 100 BCE. In the past, we've thought that these appear a little bit later under Herod, but recent studies have shown that, in fact, we have quite early evidence from the late 2nd century BCE of the emergence of this phenomenon. And the stone, it can be shown, was regarded as impervious to ritual impurity. And we find these stone vessels again everywhere where there were Judean settlements. So if we plot again where we find these chalk vessels, we find them every site where there were Judeans. We excavate enough, we'll find these shards of chalk vessels. The dating of these chalk vessels is something which has been of interest to me, both the early dating of the chalk vessels and trying to determine how late the phenomenon continues. I've excavated at 2 sites in recent years in Galilee to try to pin down when the phenomenon ends. Unlike immersion pools, which have been with us from antiquity until today, nobody uses stone vessels anymore. And the question is, when the Judeans stopped producing these stone vessels, with the assumption that the end of this phenomenon probably has something to do with the end of purity observance. This is a topic in and of itself. In short, purity observance, the earliest evidence we have, both textual and archaeological, dates to no earlier than the 2nd century before the Common Era, the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. There are no earlier texts or archaeological finds which point to Judean observance, widespread Judean observance of the purity laws. And so it's important, perhaps here's a good point to stop and point out the fact that we have prescriptive texts in the Pentateuch and elsewhere, Ezekiel, which speak about purity laws, does not indicate that ordinary Judeans were actually putting these laws into practice. So we need to stress that what we're looking for here is evidence of actual practice by ordinary Judeans. And we do not have any such evidence, either archaeological or textual, prior to the middle of the 2nd century or the Common Era. Figural art is another quite telling phenomena. Of course, the 2nd commandment, depending on how you count, but as is usually counted, the 2nd commandment prescribes not to make any graven images. And when we reach the 1st century of the Common Era, this was widely understood to mean that it was prohibited to make any kind of figural art. So any depictions of humans or animals was strictly forbidden. We find this in Judean art across the board, almost without exception. When Judeans produced art, it was without human or animal depictions. And we have to remember, this is within a world, a surrounding world, where figural art was everywhere. Think of all of the entire region around the Mediterranean at this time. We have figural art, both humans and animals, mythological depictions everywhere we look. And in Judean art, this was almost without exception absent. So I'm thinking of domestic art, mosaic floors, frescoes, stucco, and particularly this stands out with the coinage. So we find this again in the 1st century of the Common Era, and going backwards in time, we continue to find this lack of figural art going up until the Hasmonean period. The earliest coins that we have, which were minted by the Hasmoneans, were coins minted by John Hyrcanus I, and these coins stand out as lacking in figural art. When I say that they stand out, what I mean by that is that coins, we generally expect that coin will have a depiction of the ruler, of the face of the ruler. And on the Hasmonean, beginning with the Hasmonean coins, this is absent. Instead of having a graphic depiction of the ruler, instead what we have is what I would call a textual portrait, right? So we have here, for example, this coin of John Hyrcanus. It says Yehochanan HaKohen HaGadol B'Chevel HaYehudi, which means John, the high priest. Question exactly how to translate the next 2 words, but probably what it means is, and the council of the Judeans. Some of the coins say the head of the council of the Judeans, Rosh Chevel HaYehudi. In any event, this is a lot of text. These are a lot of letters that are put into one very, very small coin. And to my mind, it couldn't be more clear that what we have is an insistence that we are not going to put the face of the ruler on. Instead, we're going to put on his name, his title, as again, what I call a textual portrait rather than a graphic portrait. And we continue to find such coins with either these textual portraits or else other motifs which take the place of the face of the ruler. None of the Judean coins, almost without exception, none of the Judean coins have any human or animal depictions on them from the time of the Hashemonids and onward. When we go backwards in time, we find human and or animal depictions on every coin minted in Judea. So we have from the Ptolemaic period in the early 3rd century before the Common Era depictions of the Ptolemaic kings and an eagle or a vulture. On the other side, with the name Yehuda, the name of the province, Judea. And as we go backwards in time, we continue to find depictions of humans and animals, as I say, on every coin minted by Judeans. These are coins which some of them have the names of Judean governors, like this one, Chizkiah Pecha, and there are questions about exactly when we should date these coins, but there's general agreement that they should date to sometime within the 4th century before the Common Era, whether it's, we're talking about the Persian period or perhaps slightly after the conquest of Alexander the Great. But these are coins which are certainly quite early, likely 4th century before the Common Era. And one of the coins even has the name of what seems to be a religious figure, Yochanan HaKohen. And as I said, we have on these coins depictions of humans and or animals. This particular coin has on it the owl of Athena. So the attribute of the Greek goddess Athena, of course, it's a copy of the Athenian coins from the time, but we can't ignore the fact that we have here not only figural art, but an attribute of a foreign goddess. And again, I'm stressing this has the name of the Judean, apparently the high priest, from sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era. So when we look at figural art, again, the earliest evidence we have for abstention from figural art dates to the Hasmonean period. And here we have quite good dating because the earliest coins of John Hyrcanus, not the ones that I showed you, but an earlier series, are actually quite well dated. We know the late 30s of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So we actually have quite good dating for our terminus antiquem in terms of abstention from figural art, 132, 131 BCE, during the time of John Hyrcanus. Our terminus antiquem for abstention from figural art, similar to what we find in chapters on dietary laws and purity laws. Tefillin and mezuzot is another phenomenon that we find, again, in the 1st century of the Common Era. I'll go through this very quickly. We have 4 places in the Torah which speak of putting a sign on the hand and either a remembrance or totefot between the eyes, whatever that means. In the 1st century of the Common Era, this was understood to mean actually writing down these very passages on pieces of skin, putting them into leather cases, and wearing them on the body. We have evidence for this from the Judean desert. Of course, such materials could not be expected to survive outside of the Judean desert. But we have between 20 and 30 exemplars of these tefillin that were found in the Judean desert, Qumran, and at other sites. And the earliest evidence that we have for these tefillin goes back as well to the Hasmonean period, based on a paleographic dating of the texts paleographic dating isn't the best way to date artifacts, but that's what we're able to do with these texts. The earliest evidence we have is the Hasmonean period. The same goes for texts which have been identified as mezuzot. So twice in Deuteronomy we have prescription to write these words on your doorposts, and what have been identified as that. Also, the earliest dating that we have is the Hasmonean period. Now, of course, absence of evidence here is not necessarily evidence of absence, because we don't have many written materials at all from prior to the Hasmonean period. But again, when we're looking at the evidence that we do have, the earliest evidence dates to the Hasmonean period. We'll go through this very quickly because time is short. Miscellaneous practices, circumcision. We have biblical texts. So, okay, let's start with the first century of the Common Era. We have lots of texts which speak of Judeans circumcising. What I stress in the book is that at this time, Judeans were circumcising not simply as a cultural practice. There were other groups that were also circumcising their males. Judeans were practicing circumcision as a legal mandate. Right? This was understood to be a fulfillment of Torah law. And we continue to find evidence for circumcision as a fulfillment of Torah law going back to the 2nd century before the Common Era. Stories from Maccabean times of the Maccabean revolt. We have stories about circumcision as fulfillment of a legal mandate. Prior to this time, we have no evidence that Judeans, Israelites, were circumcising out of some kind of legal mandate. There is some evidence from the biblical text that Israelites were regarded as different from Philistines, for example, in that Philistines were uncircumcised. But there's no reason to assume that this was done out of any kind of fulfillment of the Torah law of this or that nature. Sabbath as well. When we look at first century of the Common Era, there's a plethora of textual evidence in this case that Judeans were almost universally keeping some kind of prohibition. They were abstaining from this or that activities on a seventh day. We continue to find evidence for this in the first century before the Common Era, the 2nd century before the Common Era. Prior to this, we have no compelling evidence that Judeans were, not only that they were keeping some kind of Sabbath prohibitions, they were abstaining from this or that work on the Sabbath. We actually have no indication before the 2nd century, before the Common Era, that Judeans were counting a 7-day week. So the earliest evidence we have for that, again, dates to the Hasmonean period. I know that we're going through a lot of material here. We're doing it very quick, so I can't get into the details. I'm sure that during question and answer period, questions will come up about the details of the various practices and prohibitions that we're going through here very quickly. But prior to the 2nd century, before the Common Era, there is no evidence of Judean observance of Sabbath prohibitions or even observance of the 7th day. Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread, first century of the Common Era. First thing that comes to mind is gospel stories about Jesus and his disciples celebrating Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. This is again also textual evidence for these observances. Prior to the Hasmonean period, there's no evidence for this. What I put up on the screen is, of course, a papyrus from Elephantine, which is often thought of as the Elephantine Passover letter. And this is often touted as evidence for Judean observance of Passover rules that we find in Torah. For example, abstinence from eating leaven or even having leaven in the house, fulfillment of the commandment to eat unleavened bread, and so on and so forth. And when we look at the Passover letter that was found, what has actually been found and not just reconstructed, we see that none of this is in the letter that has survived. all of the uh, parts of this letter which speak about either eating unleavened bread, matzah, or abstinence from work, and so on and so forth. All of this is in the reconstructed parts of the letter. The one word which appears, which is thought to refer to chametz, on the last line, chol min da'am zi chamir, I think has been mistranslated. Chamir doesn't mean leavened, but rather fermented. If you look at what the line is actually talking about, it's speaking about drinking or not drinking something. So the last line seems to be speaking about either drinking or not drinking some kind of fermented beverage. There's little reason to associate that at all with any kind of biblical commandments or prohibitions. Biblical texts say nothing about drinking. It's nothing about fermented in relation to the festival of unleavened bread. We actually don't have evidence for Passover observance or of the sort that we find in the Torah anytime prior to Hasmonean times. Day of Atonement as well. First century of the Common Era, we have evidence that this was that Judeans were widely observing the Day of Atonement, fasting on Yom Kippur. Philo speaks about Yom Kippur as a day when even those which were normally not particularly pious would fast. And famously, there's no evidence for the Day of Atonement, observance of fast or any kind of Day of Atonement in periods which predate the Hasmonean period. So for example, in the Ezra and Nehemiah stories, the Day of Atonement doesn't appear where we would have expected it to appear. Sukkot, copious evidence for Sukkot observance during the first century of the Common Era, particularly the coins that we have from the fourth year of the Great Revolt. We find the four species on these coins, and the earliest evidence we have for widespread observance of these rules as well, we find from the Hasmonean period. Time is short, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. In the Rote as well, we find appearing in Judean art only beginning in the Hasmonean period and onward. We have no indication that ordinary Judeans knew of the notion of a seven-branch menorah that is supposed to be standing in the temple in Jerusalem. We have no reason to think that ordinary Judeans knew of such a thing, and in fact, the menorah doesn't appear on Judean art anytime prior to the Hasmonean period. The synagogue. So as I said in the beginning of the lecture, synagogue is not a prohibition. It's not a practice which is prescribed in the Torah. But we find in the first century of the Common Era the synagogue as a preeminent Judean institution. This was the place where Judeans would gather once a week on Sabbaths, and where the one or two people in the community who knew how to read would take out a book of the law, read the Torah, and those assembled would hear the words read, and then somebody would get up and give a more dynamic interpretation of what had been read. We find this described by Josephus, by Philo, by the New Testament authors. This was something which was quite widespread throughout the world, the Judean world at the time. Basically, in all Jewish communities, as far as we know, there was a synagogue building wherein Judeans gather and hear the Torah being read. The institution of the synagogue, the earliest evidence that we have for this institution, again dates to the Hasmonean period. Our texts, almost all of them, date to the first century of the Common Era, but we actually have physical evidence of a synagogue building which dates to the Hasmonean period of Omer Rabban. So that's probably our earliest evidence for a synagogue building. Prior to the Hasmonean period, we have no evidence for synagogues. In Egypt, we have epigraphic evidence of an institution which is called a prosuche, but there's no reason to think that this was that this in any way was like a synagogue where people would gather for Torah reading. So the prosophe refers to a prayer, a place of prayer, and that's not the institution that we're talking about. So the earliest evidence we have for the emergence of an institution where we have Torah being read and spread dates to the Hasmonean period. And I think this is quite important because, to my mind, the synagogue would have been the vehicle which whereby Judaism would have spread. This would have been the vehicle whereby knowledge of the Torah would have been disseminated amongst ordinary Judeans, not only amongst intellectuals who would have been able to read the texts themselves. This leads us to our historical reconstruction. So we have very limited time. Sarah, I have about 8 minutes left. I'm looking at the clock.
Don't worry about the time, Jonathan. We want to hear from you, so please take the time you need. Yeah.
Okay. I will try to go through this quickly and leave some time for questions afterwards. So in the last chapter, what I do is I go through the evidence that we have, the contextual evidence that we have from periods of time prior to the 2nd century before the Talmud. And from here, I'm going forwards in time. So I'm going to begin with the Persian period. And when we look at the actual evidence that we have from the Persian period, we have evidence from, I would say, 3 centers: Judea, the homeland itself, Elephantine, and Babylonia. These are sites where we happen to have evidence which has survived. And when we look at the evidence from all of these sites, what we find is, so obviously by definition, this is the period of time which predates our Terminus Antiquem, which means that we have zero evidence for widespread observance of the Torah at this time. But not only do we have zero evidence for observance of the Torah, we also have evidence for apparently non-observance. I already mentioned figural art, in that on the coins that we have from Judea, we find not only figural art, we also find depictions of probably gods and goddesses, attributes of goddesses, like the owl of Athena on the coin of Yochanan, the high priest. And we also, as I mentioned, find catfish bones, shark cartilage in archaeological assemblages which date to the Persian period at Judean sites. So the evidence on the ground from Judea, although it might be anecdotal, the evidence that we do have is of non-observance. The same can be said of Elephantine. At Elephantine, we have in the papyri, in the ostraca, we have evidence that Judeans were naming their children using theophoric elements that were of non-Judean gods. We have a papyri which speak of Judeans donating monies to foreign gods, swearing oaths by foreign gods. We have a temple, a Judean temple in Elephantine, which is certainly against what we find in Deuteronomy, which prescribes a temple being built only in Cisjordan. So the fact that we have a temple, a Judean temple, to the Judean god, true, but the fact that we have a Judean temple being built outside of Cisjordan flies in the face of clear Pentateuchal prescriptions. And finally, in Babylonia as well, in the Al-Yahudu archive and the Urartu archive, we have Judeans that are naming their children using theophoric names that are of non-Judean gods. We have Judeans that are swearing oaths again by foreign gods, and we also have pictorial depictions of foreign gods on these documents, all of which would seem to fly in the face of clear Pentateuchal prescriptions. So when we look at this evidence, the conclusion that I would draw is, while, of course, it could be anecdotal, and the argument might be made that in some of these cases, this non-observance or this flouting Pentateuchal laws perhaps predates Ezra, who wanted to be Ezra quite late, or we can say that this is anecdotal. There were some Judeans that were breaking the rules. In the end of the day, I think that the Persian period, taking all of this into consideration, the Persian period is less likely a period of time within which to seek the emergence of widespread observance of Torah law. And this leads me to explore the possibility that perhaps it was only in a slightly later period that Judaism first emerges, looking at the early Hellenistic period, so after the conquests of Alexander the Great. I think this is a more likely period of time within which to see the emergence of Judaism. And what I look at is the possibility that the notion of written law, which we first find among the Greeks, had something to do with the Judeans adopting the Pentateuch as their written law. So we have law collections from Mesopotamia, which date quite early, the so-called Code of Hammurabi, Eshnuna, and so on. But scholars already from the middle of the 20th century have shown these were not actually law codes. These were not the law itself. These were used perhaps as judicial, something along the lines of what we would think of as a legal textbook today, what law students use as their textbook. That's not the law itself. So it speaks about the law, but it isn't the law itself. It was the Greeks that actually invented written law. And the suggestion that I explored, it's a suggestion which was put forth, I think it was in 2006 by Michael Lefebvre, that it was in this 3rd century before the Common Era that the Pentateuch was rethought of as, rather than as a descriptive text, as a prescriptive text. And I explored this possibility that maybe it was at this point in time under the influence of Greek culture that Judeans adopted the Pentateuch as their very own written law. So the Pentateuch presumably had been around for quite some time. It was only under Greek influence that the Pentateuch was understood and treated as actual written law. The second possibility that I explore, and I find this to be a more compelling possibility, is that it actually was the Hasmoneans that adopted the Torah as their written law, precisely at the time when the earliest evidence that we have for Torah observance begins to appear. So under this model, it is from this terminus antiquem, it's actually then when our earliest evidence begins to appear that Judaism actually did emerge. And the suggestion that I explore is that it was the Hasmoneans who are the ones that they're the ones that adopted the Torah as the law of the land. Their newly independent Judean state emerging in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, they needed something to unite the Judeans and the peoples that they were conquering towards the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era. The Torah was adopted as this uniting feature. I give the metaphor in the book of the United States having a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution, and I think the Torah served as something akin to this, to a Declaration of Independence with the stories of the emergence of Israel, and a Constitution with its laws amalgamated into one document. This would have served the Hasmoneans superbly in order to unite the Judeans around a single written law. We don't have evidence for this. We don't have evidence that it was in fact the Hasmoneans that adopted the Torah as their written law. But we do have evidence that beginning with John Hyrcanus, afterwards Aristobulus I, when they conquered foreign peoples, the neighboring peoples surrounding Judea, the Idumeans, the Etrurians, that they did in fact do this. They did in fact enforce the rules of the Torah on these conquered peoples. They enforced circumcision and keeping the rules of the Torah. I don't think it would be such a stretch to suggest that either they or their predecessors did the same thing with the Judeans themselves. In other words, that the fact that we find this as a modus operandi amongst the later Hasmoneans, I think might suggest this is something that Hasmonean rulers did. They enforced the rules of the Torah on the peoples that they ruled. I don't think it's so much of a stretch to imagine that the Hasmoneans did this amongst the Judeans themselves. And this brings us to the end of the story. What I would say is that the first 6 chapters are dated. There's not very much that we can argue against the presentation of the evidence here, unless someone has some kind of compelling evidence that Judeans were widely keeping the rules of the Torah prior to the 2nd century of the Common Era. If anyone here happens to have such evidence, I'd be happy to hear it. But I don't think there's going to be much critique on those first 6 chapters. The evidence is quite clear. There's no evidence for observance of Torah law on any wide-scale basis prior to the 2nd century before the Common Era. The last chapter, I admit, is conjectural, and there's nothing to be done about this. This is the period of time which predates when we have actual evidence. And here, we're on a different sphere of being here. We're within a sphere of conjecture. But I do think that it would be difficult to make the case for a Persian period emergence of Judaism. I think that a much more likely period of time within which to seek the emergence of Judaism would have been during the Hellenistic period, whether the early Hellenistic period or perhaps more likely the late Hellenistic period under the Hasmoneans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for a wonderful lecture. I can see we already have a lot of questions in the chat. Are you happy for me to go through them with you?
Absolutely.
So the first is from Tony Silverman. What do records of Jews in Mesopotamia show for the various indicators investigated? Okay,
so this was in the beginning. This was around 7:30. I see the question was asked. I think I dealt with that towards the end. We have from the Ali Huduk archive and Russia archive, which are Babylonian Persian period, which I mentioned, show indications that Judeans were revering gods aside from the Judean god. That's the evidence that we have from this early.
Thank you. Next question from Anthony Shepard. Why chalk vessels?
Yeah, chalk is indeed permeable to liquids. True. I don't think this had anything to do with their permeability. The reason seems to be quite simple, a technical reason. We find in Leviticus 11 that vessels made of wood and other materials are to be dipped into water if they become impure. Pottery is to be broken. Stone isn't mentioned. So it came to be understood that if stone isn't mentioned, that means it doesn't become impure at all. And chalk happens to be a material which is quite easy to work. I think there must have been some kind of coating that was put on the chalk which hasn't survived, probably some organic material. I'm doing some experimental work on that to see what it might have been, but I don't think it has anything to do with the permeability.
YB asks, how does your research coincide with DNA studies and theories about the time frame of the formation of the Israelite tribes when they became a distinct entity from other Canaanite tribes?
Okay, so to make it clear again, I'm not interested in the emergence of Judeans. I'm not interested in the emergence of Israelites as an identity, right? There could have been Israelites, Proto-Israelites, Judeans quite early, and there were, right? We have evidence from, someone had asked about Mesopotamia, from the Assyrians, Sennacherib, referring to Hezekiah the Judean. So there was a group of people in the Levant that were identifying as Judeans quite early. That's not the question that I'm pursuing in this book. I'm pursuing the question of Judaism, the observance of Torah law. So that's I'm not touching on this question at all.
Okay, thanks. Sam Levine, how does the lack of these Torah observances interact with what was going on in the temple cult?
Okay, excellent question. We don't know what was going on in the temple cult in early periods. We know that there was a temple in Jerusalem during the Persian period. We know that because we have the Elephantine documents, which were addressed to a high priest in Jerusalem, Yochanan, the high priest in Jerusalem. We have the coin of a Yochanan, a high priest. That's pretty good indication that if there was a high priesthood and a lower priesthood, likely this was going on in a temple. The priesthood was working in a temple, but what they were doing in that temple, we simply don't know. We don't know that these priests were following Torah law. We don't know that the priests were following the rules that we find in Leviticus in this temple.
We've got so many questions for you here. Carla Sulzbach, are all cases of lavishly executed synagogue floor mosaics post-2nd century CE?
Yes. The synagogues, and I don't want to get into this because this is an interesting topic in and of itself, but this post-dates the periods of time that we're interested in. Judaism begins in this early period, possibly the Hasmonean period. But Judaism evolves throughout the centuries after this. And the synagogues that you're speaking of with the zodiac floors, with Helios in the center of the zodiac, these begin to appear. The earliest would be 3rd century of the Common Era, likely later 4th century, 5th century, and after that. But this is an evolution that we find in later periods. I don't want to get into that.
So Marion has a question. El Umdan, excavated in 2001. Archaeologists dug down as far as a Persian period lair, and they think the dimensions of the building were similar over centuries. They think it would have been a place of assembly, a Beit Midrash for the villagers until it became a synagogue. The lair that is visible is 1st century CE. Unlikely this is the site of the original Modi'in.
Okay,
continues. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so the reports that we have from the excavation in El Umdan, we don't have a final report yet, but the reports that we have, I've spoken to Shlomo Betzler, surviving archaeologist from the dig. The earliest that they date the synagogue building to is the Hasmonean period. So they don't date this building to any earlier period. As far as their written reports that we had and personal communication, the Hasmonean period. So I'm not sure what this Persian period layer is. Perhaps at the site there's a Persian period. Fine, that could be. But the synagogue building itself dates to Hasmonean period.
Stephen Parkov asks, you say Greeks invented written law. What about the Hammurabi Code?
Right. So I'm not sure if we're going to get the question. I did mention that the early Mesopotamian law collections that we have are better called collections rather than codes. They were never used as written law. We know this because we have actual court dockets from Mesopotamia, which never cite any of these so-called law codes. So these were clearly functioning in a very different way than what we know of from the Greeks onwards. They didn't function as written law. This wasn't the law. They discussed law, but this wasn't the law in and of itself.
If a prosuche was not a synagogue, what was it? You did touch on that as well.
Yeah. So the term itself refers to prayer, right? This was a place of prayer. Judeans certainly had what we would call something like religion, right? So Judeans certainly served the Judean God. They had a temple in Jerusalem, and apparently, at least in Egypt, there were these prosuche buildings with inscriptions. We don't have any actual buildings that have survived or that we've been able to identify. We have inscriptions that refer to them. But these were being used as halls for prayer, presumably. Were there sacrifices being brought at these sites? I don't know. But we have no reason to think that, and this is the important point, we have no reason to think that there was Torah being read in these buildings, as we find in the later synagogue. So that's what's important for this point.
So now a question about the temple. I guess, how does your argument account for the influence of the temple service on Jewish population from the rebuilding of the Second Temple period onwards? So assuming that's observance, yes.
Right. So again, as if the temple service was practiced as we find in Leviticus, if we had any evidence for that, that would be, to my mind, evidence for observance of Torah law. We don't have evidence that the temple cult in the Jerusalem temple was practiced according to the rules that we find in the Torah. So in Leviticus, we have very detailed rules about how the various sacrifices are to be brought, who needs to bring sacrifices for what, how, where the blood needs to be sprinkled, and so on and so forth, what the priests need to be wearing. Very detailed laws. We have no evidence that this was actually being put into practice in the Persian period, for example, or anytime prior to the Hasmonid period. Not that we have so much evidence in the Hasmonid period for this, but we don't have any evidence from any earlier periods.
David Hendon asks, do you think the rise of Torah observance was linked to an increase of literacy among the general population?
That's an interesting question. What I would say, I don't know the answer to that. What I would say is, because of the synagogue, we wouldn't need an increase in literacy. All we would need is one person per community who knew how to read in order to have a spread of Torah. Right? If we have a synagogue, that's all we need. We need one person in the community that knows how to read and a Torah scroll. So you wouldn't actually need any increase in literacy among the masses. The question itself is one that I haven't looked into. But again, I think the synagogue here is the...
I could come in there just out of interest. I think you've written about the translation of the Torah into Greek as potentially significant in this context. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the question is, assuming that the Septuagint translation dates to the 3rd century, as the story goes, or even if it's a little bit later, I don't think that the translation itself, assuming that in fact the Septuagint dates to 3rd century before the Common Era, I don't think that the translation, the very fact of the translation, necessarily indicates that this is something which was widely known. And so it's easy enough to imagine that the Pentateuch was translated into Greek and not well known by the masses. Right? We don't have to assume that, we don't know why the Pentateuch was translated into Greek. We have, of course, the story of Letter of Aristeas, but putting that aside, we don't know why the Pentateuch was translated into Greek. We don't need to assume that it was translated in order to spread it among the masses. So eventually, it did serve for that purpose, but that's not necessarily the reason why it was translated.
And some translation choices might help support the idea that people were concerned with observance as well.
Translation choices might indicate that translators might have wanted that.
Yes, indeed.
Not that actually that there was a test. So there's no doubt that there were people in earlier periods who wanted Judeans to be keeping the rules of the Torah. There's no doubt of that. We find Hebrew Bible texts where the writers are insistent that people should be keeping the rules of the Torah. Right? There aren't many such texts, but we do have such texts. This indicates that there were people who thought that this is what Judeans should be doing. But again, this is intellectual history. This isn't So true.
Absolutely. Are you okay to continue with questions?
Absolutely.
They keep coming. Thank you. So, what about tithing, for which there is literary evidence as early as the 8th century prophets?
So again, I would like to see 8th century prophets that are telling us that people are actually tithing. I don't know of any such evidence.
Is your argument yet more evidence that the Book of Daniel cannot possibly have been composed before the Hasmonean period?
No, because I don't see in the Book of Daniel evidence of widespread Torah observance. The closest that we get is So in the Book of Daniel we have a reference to what seems to be prophecy of the so-called Antiochite persecutions, but the Book of Daniel doesn't speak about Torah law, and the Book of Daniel speaks about cultic matters. And what we find in Daniel could very well be interpreted as Antiochus coming in and meddling in the affairs of the temple. And again, we don't know what was going on in the temple, so we don't know that the temple was being run according to the rules of the Torah. So this could simply be Seleucid meddling in traditional Judean cultic affairs, which again does not assume observance of Torah law. So not necessarily.
Are you able to pinpoint exactly when the change happened? And how do you see the Maccabean revolt in the light of your reconstruction?
Okay, so I cannot pinpoint exactly when this happened. I'm very vague about this. So I speak about middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, because that's what our evidence indicates. I have no way of being able to pinpoint this any more directly. The closest I can get to pinpointing anything is with the coinage of John Hyrcanus I, which the earliest coins that he minted happened to date to, I believe it's 131 BCE. But these are just the earliest coins that we have. How do I see the Maccabean revolt in this light is an excellent question. So 1 and 2 Maccabees speak of Antiochine persecutions against observance of Torah law. Right? So if we take 1 and 2 Maccabees for their word, Antiochus IV persecuted the Judeans specifically on this point. Right? He disallowed observance of the Torah, which would seem to assume that Judeans were keeping the laws of the Torah prior to this time. So taking these books at their word, Judeans were observing the laws of the Torah prior to the Maccabean revolt. The problem is that both of these texts post-date the Maccabean revolt. Obviously, they tell the story of the Maccabean revolt. And they likely were written under Hasmonean rule during the time that the Hasmoneans were sovereign over Judea. And it seems to me very, at least possible, that what the writers of these texts were doing was presenting the Hasmoneans as restorers of Torah observance rather than as adopting the Torah law in the first place. So this is an ideological presentation of the past, which we cannot take as simple history.
Did Judaism migrate to Mesopotamia at a later time? Is that what you're suggesting?
At a later time, meaning from the Hasmonean period and onward? Yes, that would be the suggestion. We actually don't have very much evidence at all about Judeans in Mesopotamia during the Seleucid period and onward, until really we get to Babylonian Talmud times. We don't have a heck of a lot of evidence, certainly not material evidence, and textual evidence as well. So, yeah, for sure we have no evidence of Judean observance of Torah law anytime prior to the Hasmonean period in Mesopotamia as well.
Hugh Williamson asks, how would you categorize the region of Judah in the Persian period?
How would I categorize the region?
The religion.
Oh, sorry, the religion. I misread it. Sorry, don't worry. Sorry, Hugh.
Not your fault. It was miswritten. Yeah, I also would have read region. The religion of Judea. Okay, so as far as we know, there is little reason to think that the so-called religion of Judea during the Persian period was very much different from the so-called religion of Judea in the Iron Age. So I don't know the answer, but I can imagine some kind of continuation of the traditional Judean cult and general culture from the Iron Age into the Persian period. And actually, archaeologists today tend to think there is a continuation of material culture from the Iron Age into the Persian period. I see no reason to think that very much changed in Judean religion from the Iron Age into the Persian period. Until we have adoption of Torah law, we don't know exactly what people were doing. But as I said, there seems to be reverence or recognition of foreign gods in this early period. So it seems to be a continuation of what we find from the Iron Age.
Did you want to come back, Hugh?
If I may come back, thank you. The problem, as I see it, is that the Iron 1 and 2 religion was a state religion where you've got a king at the top and so on and so forth. From the exile on, that no longer is the case. And therefore, many of the laws in the Torah, whatever state it was then, are effectively redundant. Now, you said early on you're not interested in the intellectual history. It seems to me that it's precisely as ascribed to Ezra, we can debate whether it was Ezra or not, where you begin to reinterpret the laws which are no longer applicable in a different direction, that I see intellectually as very crucial for the forging of Judaism. I accept your points, of course, about ritual baths and all the rest of it. We don't have evidence for that earlier. But it does seem to me that the shift from a state religion to what eventually became Judaism must be going on there in the Persian period. And that was what behind my question, because they cannot be practicing religion as they did when there was a monarchy.
Okay. So what, again, as you pointed out, I'm not interested in the question of intellectual history and what these scribes are doing with, as you called it, interpretation of these rules. All of this is well and fair, but what I'm interested in is what the people are actually doing. And in terms of, I don't like using the term religion, and I think it's a bit of an anachronism. Let's use it for since you used it. I'll blame you for it. The household religion, let's say, that we have in the Iron Age, I see no reason why this could not have continued into the Persian period. And in fact, the names of the deities that we find in the Persian period documents from Elephantine are names that we find already in the Iron Age. Anat, Anat-Yahu, Herem Bethel, and so on and so forth. This seems to be a continuation of what we find from early periods of time, but the evidence is sparse. The point is that there's no reason to think that Torah was being observed at this early period. That's what's interesting.
We have a few last questions, if you'll bear with us. David Jacobson, we do have temples in late Iron Age Judea, such as Arad, where the evidence indicates that Torah law, as we know it, was not observed. Do we have any other instances which suggest otherwise?
From the Iron Age, sure. Have the figurines and so on and so forth. So I don't go into great detail in terms of the Iron Age because it's quite well accepted that there was no observance of Torah law among scholarship. Scholars generally know that there was no observance of Torah law in the Iron Age. So I focus on the Persian period onwards. But yeah, I mean, there's little doubt that there was any kind of observance of Torah law in Iron Age Judea.
And Hadass Misgov makes a comment on that point about the prophets. But I think we give the final question to Roberta Harris. What does this, I guess, your argument mean for the date of the composition of the elements of the law as Torah? There's a big question to finish on.
In terms of, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What does this mean for the date of the composition of the elements of the law qua Torah?
Right. So again, I need to stress this, and I find that textual scholars, particularly biblical scholars, have a hard time wrapping their head around this distinction that I'm insisting upon between intellectual history and social history. The fact that Judeans at large came to know about the Torah and to observe the Torah at a late date, let's say from the Hasmonean period and onward, says nothing about when the texts themselves were written. Okay? So the debates that we have about when the Pentateuchal texts were first written down, when they were edited, redacted, and so on, all of this could have happened quite early. I'm not making any statement about this. I don't know. To be honest, I don't think biblical scholars know either, even though they claim that they do. But I'm quite skeptical about dating various texts in any direction. But certainly what I have to say has no bearing at all on the dating of these texts. The text could be very early. The question that I'm asking is, when did they become known? And it might be very hard for us to imagine that these texts, which are so seminal for Western civilization, could have been ignored, not known about amongst ordinary people, right? I could certainly imagine that the Pentateuch was formed and stood on a shelf, gathering dust for centuries. That's certainly a possibility. And if it wasn't gathering dust on a shelf, it might have been held in great esteem by a very small cadre of scribes or pietists who thought this was something important and should be kept. But that doesn't suggest what I'm calling here Judaism, a way of life which governed a society that we don't have any early evidence for. So I'm making a very clear distinction between intellectual history and social history.
Jonathan, thank you so much for taking all those questions from our audience and for an absolutely superb lecture. We're so fortunate to have heard from you so soon after your book is hot off the press. It's been fantastic to hear with such clarity the different stages of the argument. I don't think we'll be forgetting what you've told us in a very long time. It's really wonderful. And we look forward very much, we hope, to hearing from you again in the near future to hear about what you're doing next. And it's left us, as you can see, with many questions. For me, I think also it makes me think, well, what did people in the Hellenistic period or first century CE, did they remember the beginnings in the Hasmonean period and what awareness? But so that's left me certainly with an interesting question to explore. Thank you very, very much indeed. You've really enriched our thinking about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Very much.
Pleasure. It just remains for me to thank everyone for coming tonight, but also to announce that we have a very exciting series of lectures coming up in February and March. Professor Oded Lipschitz from Tel Aviv University will be giving a number of lectures in London, in Southampton, and in St Andrews in Scotland. If you are in any of those places, you are very, very welcome to attend. The first of the lectures will be at the University College London Institute of Archaeology on the 20th of February at 6 o'clock UK time. And his topic will be the sound of silence about palaces, administrative centres and temples near Jerusalem, completely ignored by the biblical text. So we look forward to that very much and to seeing you all again. Once again, thank you so much, Jonathan. Good evening to everyone. Thank you.